Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be here with you today. Something really shocking happened because we often discuss sort of the ebbs and flows of the trans movement. And we have talked for a while that it is in significant retrograde at the moment, whether it's the Supreme Court case or the case ruling in the UK. But now we are seeing even mainstream leftist newspapers. The New York Times did a number of trans critical stuff, but the Atlantic. And if people are like, well, is the Atlantic really a leftist newspaper? So I decided to ask an AI, just be like, what does AI think? Left or right political leaning? So it says the Atlantic leans left politically. Its coverage often emphasizes progressive issues like social justice, climate change, and critiques of conservative politicians.
Okay.
So very left-leaning publication, okay? So they had a piece titled, "The Liberal Misinformation Bubble About Youth Gender Medicine, How the Left Ended Up Disbelieving the Science" by Helen Lewis. And so mainstream leftist publication allows this piece to be published. And this happens immediately after. Now, normally when the trans movement historically had suffered major defeats, the leftists would all come around to rally around it. You know, you had this with recently the court ruled that Tennessee's law, which prohibits hormone therapies and puberty blockers for transgender minors with gender dysphoria, does not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And in fighting this, very interestingly, because a lot of papers were unveiled and sort of the best trans arguers, like the people who are pro-trans, got against the best anti-trans arguers in a very recorded stage where all evidence had to be counted and you couldn't just make stuff up. They basically had to concede that they had made up a bunch of the arguments that people had accepted as fact. And you might be surprised by some of the arguments that even the top tier of the trans community now admits are just fictional. And this also comes downstream of not just the Cass report, but the UK in law now, making it so that if you are a company in the UK now, and you let a trans woman use a woman's bathroom, you can be sued by your female staff.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this is some serious
So this
stuff.
is significant in terms of how things are changing, but I want to
Yeah.
dive into the article here. Allow children to transition or they will kill themselves. For more than a decade, this has been the strongest argument in favor of youth gender medicine, a scenario so awful that it stifled any doubts or questions about puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. We often ask parents, and this is a quote here, "Would you rather have a dead son than a live daughter?" Joanna Olson Kennedy of Children's Hospital Los Angeles once explained to ABC News. So this was somebody who was working at a children's hospital in a major city, says, "We at the hospital often go to parents and say, would you rather have a dead son or a live daughter?" Variations on this phrase crop up in innumerable media articles and public statements by influencers, activists, and LGBT groups. The same idea that the choice is transition or death appeared in the arguments made by Elizabeth Prager, the Biden administration's Solicitor General, before the Supreme Court last year. Tennessee's law prohibiting the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to treat minors with gender dysphoria would, she said, quote, "increase the risk of unaliving," end quote. But there is a huge problem with this emotive format. It isn't true. When Justice Samuel Alito challenged the ACLU lawyer Chase Stragio on such claims during oral arguments, Stragio made a startling admission. He conceded that there was no evidence to support the idea that medical transition reduced adolescent unaliving rates. And this is a really, really big deal because this is if you're looking at like media, when these people go on media, nobody can with any sort of legal justification say, hey, does the evidence actually say this? Like they're not actually forced to tell the truth. And this is why this case has been so damaging to the movement, because it forced their top advocates who have more knowledge of all of their arguments and all of the research than anyone else to tell the truth on issues that we just didn't have a public forum to pin them down on before. And the truth is there is not evidence, and there's even more evidence now because the UK banned this, and now we have studies that have looked at the unaliving rates post-ban versus the unaliving rates pre-ban, which we'll get into later here, and there's no difference. So we now know that this is fictional. And potentially that things like puberty blockers actually increased unaliving rates, and we'll get into evidence of that as well. But it's not from this paper, it's from other evidence that she doesn't appear to be aware of. At first, Strategio dodged the question, saying that the research shows that blockers and hormones reduce, quote unquote, depression, anxiety, and unaliving, that is, unaliving thoughts. Even that is debatable according to reviews of literature research. So here are the two reviews that she cites are pediatric gender medicine longitudinal studies have not consistently shown improvement in depression or unaliving rates. Hormone therapy, mental health, and quality of life among transgender people, a systematic review. But when Alito referenced systematic review conducted in the Cass report in England, Strategio conceded the point. Quote, there is...
Are you talking about Chase Strangio?
Strangio, whatever you want to call him, Strategio. He can be called whatever.
I think most people say Strangio.
Okay. Yeah. There is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completing unaliving rates, he said. And the reason for that is that completing unaliving, thankfully and admittedly, is rare. And we're talking about a very small population of individuals which the studies that don't necessarily have completed rates within them. So note, but the actual rates, are they higher? And he was forced to say, no, they're not higher. Wow. And note here that because this is something that would show up, like there's big studies on this. These aren't like small studies. He's forced to admit that this is just not in the evidence. And it's not just the studies that she's noting here that show that he was lying when he said that you have higher rates of, for example, self-harm. Because, for example, we know from the Tavistock clinic, which we'll go into, after it was shut, or during the process of shutting it down, it was found that they had done a study that showed that puberty blockers were increasing ideation, they were increasing self-harm, they were increasing a lot of this other stuff, and that they had decided not to publish this for, obviously goes against their narrative. They said it was because the data was poor. Yeah, the data's poor because it doesn't support what you want it to support. But that's not the way science works normally, you know what I mean? And so we're seeing that even the evidence he's citing here is no longer backed by like the big meta studies as she was citing. Here was the trans rights movement's greatest legal brain speaking in front of the nation's highest court. And what he was saying is that the strongest argument for a hotly debated treatment was in fact not supported by the evidence. Even then, his admission did not register with the liberal justices. And I find this really like messed up, right? When the court voted 6-3 to uphold Tennessee law, Sonia Sotomayor claimed in her dissent that, quote, access to care can be a question of life or death, which is, she heard the arguments in the data that is factually untrue. And yet what you see from this liberal perspective is facts, when they go against their reality, appear unable to pierce the veil of their world perspective. They have an intensely theocratic and religious world perspective that prevents them from interacting with an external narrative that honestly reminds me a lot of when because I grew up in Dallas, Texas, the extremist evangelical. Which actually, if you talk to like educated evangelicals today or educated like extremist Catholics today, they're familiar with all the counter arguments. Like they're because they're now not a dominant cultural force within any particular region of the United States in a way where they are not exposed to the other side. They're forced to learn the other side. Whereas people like Sonia Sotomayor just are not forced to engage with an external perspective. And so they are able to sort of petrify their brain and harden themselves to external information sources.
Interesting.
If she meant any kind of therapeutic support, that might be defensible. But claiming that this is true of medical transition specifically, the type of care being debated in the Scameti case, is not supported by current research. Advocates of the open science movement often talk about zombie facts, popular sound bites that persist in public debate even after they had been repeatedly discredited. The one that Simone always loves is the number of straws that go in the ocean, which came from a sixth grader's science report for like a fair project. It was like a science fair project.
Yeah, but a new one that I just read about from Scott Sanders' June link roundup was that chess grandmasters burn 6,000 calories a day, which is based on some really crazy speculation that weirdly involves Robert Sapolsky.
Which is wild.
Yeah, because they don't.
Many common political claims made in defense of puberty blockers and hormones for gender dysphoric minors meet this definition. These zombie facts have been flatly contradicted, not just by conservatives, but also by prominent advocates and practitioners of the treatment, at least when you're speaking to them candidly. Many
Mm.
liberals are unaware of this. However, because they are stuck in media bubbles in which well-meaning commentators make confident assertions for use gender medicine, claims for which its elite advocates have long since retreated. And this is really, and I think this point is really interesting because I have, trans friends. I have friends who are very educated, like ultra progressives and stuff like this. And there is a class of them that you can engage them about these facts and been like, hey, yeah, like, this fact isn't true. And they're like, yeah, I know that fact isn't true. This fact isn't true. Oh, yeah, I know that fact isn't true. And they're like, yeah, but I still, when I'm arguing publicly, sometimes I'll, retreat to them to make big, dramatic claims. But it is remarkable to me how many of the elites will, in private, when I am speaking with them, be like, oh, yeah, I know all that stuff isn't true. But, this is my team, basically. Or what am I supposed to do? Publicly say there isn't evidence for this? And you've seen this too, right, Simone? One of the ones that I found most interesting to me that was coming to me from a trans friend at one of our parties who we were talking to was they were like, I was like, candidly, like within the communities, how much is this like just like a sex or arousal thing, right? Like not a gender. And they're like, the reason why that talk of that gets shut down so heavily publicly is because within the community, everybody knows that when we're behind closed doors, this is predominantly an arousal thing.
Oh no. Oh no.
For at least a chunk of the community, right? Like
Yeah.
not everyone, but at least a big chunk of the community. And the community mostly admitted this when they had the fight between the true scums and the too cutes. For people who don't know, there was a portion of the community that said you are born this way, and that was the true scum. When they were named the true scum by the too cutes, who said, well, if you say you're born this way, then that medicalizes it, and really it's just a choice. And so the mainstream perspective in the community is this is just a choice now. And so this is what the educated people, and you'll go out and you'll hear progressive, and they'll say they don't have a choice over this. And they won't realize that this isn't what the mainstream trans community is arguing anymore. But they think that this is the position, right? They think, oh, these people will, which I find really interesting. Perhaps the existence of this bubble shouldn't be surprising. Many of the most fervent advocates of youth transition are also on the record disparaging the idea that it should be debated at all. Stragio, who works for the country's best-known free speech organization, once tweeted that he would like to scuttle Abigail Schreyer's book, Irreversible Damage, a skeptical treatment of youth gender medicine. Abigail Schreier is fantastic, by the way. We've chatted with her.
She's so cool.
Yeah. Stragio declared, stopping the circulation of this book and these ideas is 100% a hill I'll die on.
Wow.
He works for the country. The United States is #1 free speech organization, and he advocates
He'll die on the hill stopping a book.
Of this book, right? I mean, it's a book that if you read it is not like a spurious attack. It's a list of facts and studies. Wow. Massia Bowers, the former head of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH, the most prominent organization for gender medicine providers, has likened skepticism of child gender medicine to Holocaust denial. There are not two sides of this issue, she once said, according to a recent episode of The Protocol, a New York Times podcast. And you've seen this as well. It's not surprising that if they say questioning this is the equivalent of participating in the Holocaust. And this is normalized within places like the New York Times and stuff like that. You've seen this, Simone. I mean, talk to your experience. You grew up in San Francisco. You grew up likely believing that, this is not a thing that should be discussed or talked about.
Okay. Yeah, I can speak to that. Yeah. It definitely blew my mind when I met you and I discovered that it was allowable to express.
It is not allowable, or at least not
okay. Well, no, that outside the progressive bubble, it was allowable because there were a lot of things that I just thought I don't know how to articulate it well. I literally thought I couldn't believe them. It wasn't about even expressing certain views like, oh, well, behind closed doors, I think and say this, but in public, I would never say it. It's more that actually it was like a thought crime, like literally a thought crime that I didn't think
in your own brain. Like you wouldn't consider it. Your brain wouldn't.
I wouldn't allow myself to think these things. And it made me less mentally healthy and it made me very uncomfortable because I was forced to do and engage with things that I really didn't feel comfortable doing and engaging with, because
Can
I
you
wasn't
explain, like, an
allowed to not be
example you
okay with those
remember
things.
where you felt uncomfortable?
What do you mean?
You said it forced you to do and engage with things that made you feel uncomfortable. Can you think of
Yeah,
an example?
like working at homeless shelters, like, going to certain parties and being okay with what was happening there, like being
Like sex
okay with the way
parties
that
and
certain
stuff,
people.
and you were just like, "Ugh."
Yeah, like, just not super, like, not being okay with it and not being comfortable with it, but having to act like it's okay and having to go along with it and act like everything was fine, and it wasn't. It wasn't fine, not, at least not for me.
Yeah, I
But
remember you
not
talked about.
feeling allowed to not be cool with it, which was
Yeah. You talked about, like, a cuddle party or something where you were like,
yeah, like if
pressured.
if I hung out with friends and everyone was like, "Okay, we're all gonna, like, cuddle on the couch," I'm like, "Well, yeah, I'm supposed
I
to be
can
okay
imagine
with
2
this."
nightmares worse for an autistic woman like you.
It
Uh,
really was nightmarish, and beyond that, because I felt like I had to be okay with it, it also gave people like, super the wrong idea about me.
well, and I think that many people, I mean, this is how this culture, and I think how some sex past males weaponize this culture to get past progressive lesbians, like natural resistance to them, and attempt to, when people are like, you couldn't actually force someone to believe that they were aroused by something they weren't
Oh,
aroused by.
you can,
Yeah.
absolutely,
It's like
because,
the
yeah,
more
there
the
were
important thing is to look,
absolutely things that you're allowed to be aroused by and that you're not allowed to be aroused by.
when you're not allowed to say, I don't want this pursuit. I
Oh,
don't want to do this. I don't
100%.
want to, and they basically
Like, it
learn.
wouldn't be okay for me to say, "Don't touch me." I mean, I know that, like, a progressive person would argue, like, "No, of course, you need to express how you feel, etcetera," but, like, I didn't feel like it was okay to express my desire to not be touched by other
Well, and we
people.
see this with trans individuals complaining about lesbians and how they're transphobic if they're not interested in them and stuff like that. And you see them weaponizing this discomfort, which I think is really horrifying that people have been basically treated as like ideological slave caste
Yeah.
for anybody who's willing to predatorize the system.
Mhm.
But to continue, boasting about your unwillingness to listen to opponents probably plays well in some crowds, e.g., Greta Thunberg not even being willing to watch Hamas propaganda about what they did during the October 7th attacks that the Israelis tried to show them. She's like, I
Yeah.
will not expose myself to this information. And apparently this plays well in her crowd. I want my knowledge to be entirely one-sided.
Which is really scary. I mean, like, if you're not willing to even entertain opposing views in any way, that implies to me that you are so threatened by them that you just assume that your mind will be changed if you're exposed to them.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so weird to me. I even at one point for Lemon Week, the month where we, for our Techno Puritan holiday, engage with ideas that we consider to be offensive. And an idea that I consider to be offensive is this idea that there are certain ideas that you shouldn't engage with, or that there are certain people that you shouldn't engage with because of their ideas. Because this is a very, like, progressive idea. And I was presented with some arguments that I found to be convincing. But it's only really under specific scenarios. Like, let's say you're having a public debate where you're holding, you're presenting one argument and the other person is presenting the other argument. And that argument is a really harmful argument. And they're also more, like, attractive and charismatic than you. Then by debating them, you are platforming
Well,
a
and that's
date,
why
like,
progressives shouldn't debate conservatives in public because they're so often like
because
fat.
we're more curious. Well, but, like, yeah, I mean, like, when there are exogenous factors that will make other people believe someone's argument, not because they have a better argument, but because they're more charismatic. Like, I could see that kind of being a place where it's not worth it to have the debate and to engage with them. But, just her watching that content is not one of these scenarios. Like, I agree now, after trying to really engage with this concept, that some ideas should not be engaged with, that there are some scenarios where, okay, maybe we should back off, not have the debate, whatever. But this was not one of them. And, like, what was she thinking? I mean, I wish
Yeah.
I could have a conversation with her about that to understand how she justifies that.
But it left Stragio badly exposed in front of the Supreme Court, where it became clear that the conservative justices had read the most convincing critiques of hormone and blockers and had some questions as a result.
Some questions.
Questions.
I have questions.
Trans rights activists like to accuse skeptics of youth gender medicine and publications that dare report their views as fomenting a quote unquote moral panic. But the movement has spent the past decade telling gender nonconforming children that anyone who tries to restrict access to puberty blockers and hormones is effectively trying to kill them. This was false. And Strangio's answer tacitly conceded it was also irresponsible. After England restricted the use of puberty blockers in 2020, the government asked an expert psychologist, Lewis Appleby, to investigate whether the unaliving rate for patients at the country's youth gender clinic rose dramatically as a result. It did not. In fact, he did not find any increase in unaliving rates at all, despite the lurid claims made online.
Ew.
The way that this issue has been discussed on social media has been insensitive, distressing, and dangerous, and goes against guidance on safe reporting on unaliving, Appleby reported. One risk is that young people and their families will be terrified by predictions of unaliving as inevitable without puberty blockers. And this study that's referenced here that showed that the rates didn't go up is Review of Unaliving and Gender Dysphoria at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust. And then BBC also did an article, Puberty Blocker Curb has not led to an increase in unaliving. And I note here, all of this, and note here, I just always change out that one word for unaliving because YouTube is incredibly strict about that word. So just, when you're trying to find these studies, use your brain here, people. But I would note here, because we know that unaliving talk is incredibly contagious, in media, you're typically not even supposed to report like cases where it happens because it leads to huge rises in the rate that it happens. Because we know it's contagious and because we know that talk is so heavy within these communities, the fact that the rates haven't gone up is uniquely striking, and it shows likely an inverse total effect if you could remove this discussion and these narratives from the public. When red state bans are discussed, you will also hear liberals say that conservative fears about the medical transition pathway are overwrought because all children get extensive personalized assessments before being prescribed puberty blockers and hormones. This too is untrue. Although the official standards of care recommended through assessment over several months, many American clinics say they will prescribe puberty blockers at first visit.
Yeah.
I not only have seen this in honestly, the majority of detransition cases I've heard about, the majority.
And we've heard this from parents, which, is
I've heard this from parents.
helpful.
The doctors will lie to the parents and give it to the kids. That happened to one of our friends.
Yeah.
They'll say, oh, we didn't give it to the kids. Actually, we need to do a follow-up study. And by the time the follow-up study happens, because the kid doesn't actually book it, the parent assumes that, hey, the phase is over. But the kid has been on puberty blockers and sterilized themselves 6 months ago. The kid doesn't realize they've done it. They don't realize they've sterilized themselves. The parent doesn't realize the kid has done it. They were prescribed this under the table because the parent did the very silly thing of taking their kid to a psychologist, which again, we are radically against. Like the modern psychologist movement and psychiatrist movement, especially gender, the psychologists do not engage with. They are very dangerous. They cause way more harm than help at this point. I mean, when people talk about like the mental health problem of our society and they're like, well, we need more psychologists, I'm like, it seems to have risen in correlation to the number of psychologists and the amount of money we're spending on psychologists. That should tell you something, but you could look at any of our videos on psychologists of how that happened, because you actually see this in the numbers. It's not necessarily healthy, and especially the ones that focus on the gender stuff. But here we see the citing that I had above, where I was like, many psychologists will get this to them on their first. Reuters discusses this as more transgender children seek medical care. Families confront many.
Reuters? You mean like the news service?
The news service, yes, mainstream news service. Silence yourself.
I love when you mispronounce things so much.
This isn't just a matter of U.S. health providers skimping on talk therapy to keep costs down. Some practitioners view long evaluations as unnecessary and even patronizing. Quote, I don't send someone to a therapist when I'm going to start them on insulin, end quote, Olson Kennedy told The Atlantic in 2018. Her published research shows that she has referred girls as young as 13 for double mastectomies. 13. And
for the surgery. Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And what if these children later regretted their decisions? She says, quote, adolescents actually have the capacity to make reasoned, logical decisions, end quote. She once told an industry seminar, quote, if you want breasts at a later point in life, you can always just get them, end quote.
I mean, there are some things about this that I love. I think that broadly speaking, progressive culture infantilizes youth. It's funny that there's this selective de-infantilization. Like, kids aren't allowed to be grown-ups in any way. You know, they're helicopter parented. They're not allowed to walk home from school. But then in this one place, in this one area, they can consent. Yeah. They're adults.
And there's one to whatever they want, right? Whatever, no matter how crazy, no matter what their parents think, because the alternative is that they will unalive themselves, even though we know that that is factually untrue.
It is really comforting to see, though, that like, because part of me worried that even if there was not, I guess, a medical or body dysmorphic reason why people would ultimately be more likely to end themselves if they didn't get gender affirming care. I'm worried that the narratives around that would be enough. Basically, that because so many people said you will want to end your life if you don't get this care, that when people started being denied it, that they would be more likely to, but it appears that that's not happening. So I'm relieved, because I thought there would sort of be this nocebo effect.
I think it's important to note what a phase this is. We know from the research. It's funny that she doesn't cite this in her paper, but there is a study, Gender Discontentedness and Gender Nonconforming Youth, that came out in 2023 that showed of 13-year-olds who are not satisfied with their birth gender, over 9 in 10 of them are completely satisfied with it by the age of 23. So this woman who is assigning a 13-year-old a double mastectomy, we now know from the research there was over a 90% chance that she would not have wanted that mastectomy if she had waited. She would not have wanted to convert her gender if
well, that's because, I mean, I think most people can, well, not most maybe, but at least many people can relate that kind of just having a human body during puberty sucks. And it's very easy to think, oh, the problem is that I'm male/female. Whereas like, no, the problem is that you're going through puberty and it sucks.
And once you get through puberty, you're going to be comfortable.
You're going to be fine. Yeah, regardless of whether you're male or female. It's the change itself that is not fun. It's not what you're changing into.
But the point here being is that now that we know from the evidence, from peer-reviewed studies, over 90% of these people are going to, this is a phase for them. And keep in mind, for the final 10%, we can't even say that it's not a phase because of other things, but you can look at our other episodes that go into more research around the trans community and everything like that. This episode is primarily about this article, which I found really fascinating because it shows a changing progressive mindset around what you're allowed to say and what the new mainstream narrative is about this. And I think we might be seeing the dam bursting, basically, was in mainstream Democrat culture. And what happens to the crazies, I think they may be pushed aside in the same way that conservatives push aside, your actual racists. And I think that that's what's, or that we pushed our actual anti-Semites to the Democratic Party. Who knows where these people are going to go? They're going to go to some, extremist party, but whatever. Perhaps the greatest piece of misinformation believed by liberals, however, is that the American standards of care in this area are strongly evidence-based. In fact, at this point, the fairest thing to say about the evidence surrounding medical transition for adolescents, the so-called Dutch protocol as opposed to talk therapy and other support, is that it is weak and inconclusive. A further complication is that American child gender medicine has deviated significantly from this original protocol in terms of length of assessments and a number and demographics of minors being treated. Yes, as activists are keen to point out, most major medical associations support the Dutch protocol, but consensus is not the same as evidence. And that consensus is politically influenced. And it obviously is at this point, and not politically influenced, but influenced by people risking losing their jobs. If I'm at a mainstream organization or medical organization historically, and I said, I have a problem with this, I could lose my job. And if people are like, well, that's not true, look at how hard mainstream, not even just trans organizations, but leftist organizations have tried to get, the people who constructed the Cass report fired for just doing science.
Yeah.
Right? That if you were right about what you're saying, that you wouldn't try to get these people fired. Look at every instance in which somebody has defected and you have tried to get them fired. Right? And the evidence isn't on your side anymore. So now it's like a big problem, right? Rachel Levine, President Joe Biden's Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services, successfully lobbied to have age minimums removed for most surgeries from the standard care up by WPATH. That was a deeply political decision. Levine, according to emails from her office, reviewed by The Times, believed that listing any specific limits under the age of 18 would give opponents of youth transition hard targets to exploit. That's really psychotic. The White House was promoting this to stick it to what they saw were people who were critical of used transgender stuff, despite that they knew that the evidence wasn't on their side on these issues. And the amount that this happens, I think, is something that people really need to wrestle with internally, because it is chilling if you are wrong when you look at the evidence of what happens to these people who commit to this, and the 50% to 40% attempted unaliving rates within the trans community. If this community is something that people are being railroaded into when they otherwise wouldn't, you need to seriously consider with what you have imposed on these individuals' lives with those sorts of unaliving rates.
Yeah.
It is a form of horror and self-hatred above, I think, really anything else you can imagine. And I think if you want to learn what happens to even the individuals who feel like this has been successful to them, what their daily life becomes, check out the Day in the Life of a Cenobite episode about Anna Valen's life from her own personal blog. This is the trans woman.
Spoiler alert. It's dark.
It's dark. It's very dark, even among the people who think that everything went well for them. More recently, another court case over banning blockers and hormones, this time in Alabama, has revealed that WPATH members themselves had doubts about their own guidelines. In 2022, Alabama passed a law criminalizing the prescription of hormones and blockers to patients under 19. After the Biden administration sued to block the law, the state's Republican Attorney General subpoenaed documents showing that WPATH has known for some time that the evidence base for adolescent transition is thin. Quote, all of us are painfully aware that there are many gaps in the research to back up recommendations, end quote. Ellie Coleman, the psychologist who chairmaned the team revising the standards of care, wrote to his colleagues in 2023. So the guy who chairmaned the committee who handled these revisions in leaked emails said, and I quote, all of us are painfully aware that there are many gaps in the research that back our recommendations. And these recommendations could lead to children committing to a life path that leads to a 50% unaliving rate. You understand that, right? Do you understand how horrifying that is? A life path that we know 9 out of 10 from gender discontentedness and gender nonconforming youth 2023, over 9 and 10 of them are going to desist from naturally. Yet the organization did not make this clear to the public. So he didn't say that wasn't, that they, like when they released the report arguing for this, they didn't say, and the evidence is thin in this. Laura Edwards-Lepper, who helped bring the Dutch protocol to the US, but has since criticized it in a Washington Post op-ed, the unquestioning gender-affirming care model, has said that the specter of red state bans made her and her op-ed co-author reluctant to break ranks. So the very person who brought this model into the United States has since said this was a mistake. That's where we are, by the way, in terms of like, what do the expert thinks? The experts that told you to start doing this have said, oops, you guys went crazy with this. We shouldn't have done this. But because so many people have committed to this, and I think a way that causes so much cognitive dissonance, if you look at our John Money episode on the individual that things like sexual orientation and the concept of gender is different than sex come from, when we look at the horrifying research he did that he lied about for a long time to people, where he, said, oh, well, if you're raised a different gender, you're actually going to be that gender for the rest of your life. And then it turns out that not only is this not true, but it turned out he was likely a PDA file because he made these people, like two brothers, sleep with each other and then filmed it and then
perform
they ended
more like sexual foreplay in this case. But as children, while he watched and when they tried to resist, he like berated them. But what happened specifically with, long story short, there was a baby who had a botched circumcision, and he advised the parents to just raise the baby as a girl. And he wasn't told, he didn't find out until he was a teen that he was actually a natal male. So he genuinely had been told all his life that he was a girl, raised to be a girl, performatively told to be a girl. And he detransitioned after that, which I think really does go to show that even if all you ever knew was being a girl, and you went through, and he underwent additional surgical and hormonal interventions under John Money's intervention, he still desisted. So just to clarify,
really important here is John Money hid for decades that this person had detransitioned,
which led to thousands more parents to when their children had some kind of, genital problem as babies, raise them as the, I guess.
Well, get surgical intervention to try to make them conform to a specific gender, and then
Yeah, so
raise them
basically
as a
he did an experiment. The experiment failed, and he lied about the failure of his experiment, and many, many, many more
But when
people
you
did a
ask
thing that would
why
have
did
been.
he lie about this, I think that this is important to this context because it's the same thing happening again, is that he would have to admit the horror that was downstream of his original mistake.
Mm,
And I think if you're looking at the existing movement, it's why don't they accept that the evidence now says you are mutilating kids, destroying their lives, and leading to a really high unaliving rate that wouldn't otherwise exist?
mm.
It's because if they admit that, then they've been the bad guys all along. Worse than that, it means that many of these trans individuals who never really intended to fully pass and are just doing this to sort of force themselves on other people, but now they can't look like anything other than trans individuals when they walk out in public. They're like that guy from the end of whatever that movie is about Nazis, where they carve the swastika into his forehead. So, everybody knows for the rest of his life that because he was being let free, right? And they're
Oh.
like, we're not going to let you live the rest of your life as a truly free person. People are going to know what you stood for and the harm that you caused for the rest of your life.
When you get to your little place on Nantucket Island, I imagine you won't take off that handsome-looking SS uniform of yours. Ain't you? So, I'm gonna give you a little something you can't take off.
And being a poorly passing trans person, being an Alec Vaidmanen for the rest of your life is going to be like having a swastika carved in your forehead as the public begins to normalize to this more and more. When they realize that even when the evidence said this stuff is wrong, you were still sending 13-year-old girls to have double mastectomies. And we note from the WPATH files, the other thing that leaked is they admit, they go, the kids do not understand. This is WPATH, the main organization pushing for this in the United States. That in internal emails, they've said these kids they haven't had biology classes yet. They don't understand the implications of what these puberty blockers mean, of what it means to never have an orgasm, which is one of the potential effects of puberty blockers, of what it means to be sterile, of what it means to have these complications for your entire life.
Well, and
They
what
often
bothers
think
me is not only are they not being told about this, but also, even if they were told about it, they're at a phase in their life where they'd be like, yeah. I mean, remember when I was a virgin, I fantasized about, despite having no plans to have sex, having my uterus removed, having a hysterectomy, because I was just so enthusiastic about the idea of not having children.
Yeah,
And I mean, now I have almost, 5 kids,
but the point I'm
5 is on
making
the way.
here is that the people who run the organizations promoting this, internal memos note these kids definitely don't know what they're consenting to.
Yeah,
And we
absolutely.
don't even try to explain to them what they're consenting to because we understand they don't have the mental capacity to understand it.
Yeah.
And they as well know that over 9 out of 10 of them desist. So we're also going to talk about that. Just going forward here. I can't stop mentioning that statistic. The Alabama litigation has also confirmed that WPATH has commissioned a systemic review of the evidence for the Dutch protocol. However, close to publication, the Johns Hopkins University researcher involved was told that their findings needed to be, quote, scrutinized and reviewed to ensure that the publication does not negatively affect the provision of transgender healthcare, end quote, which obviously it would if it showed that healthcare was harming people.
Mhm.
This is not how evidence-based medicine is supposed to work. You don't start with a treatment and then ensure that only studies that support that treatment are published. In a legal filing in the Alabama case, Coleman insisted, quote, it is not true, end quote, that WPATH guidelines, quote, turned on any ideological or political considerations, end quote. And that the group's dispute with Johns Hopkins researcher concerned only the timing of the publication. That is factually untrue, we now know from the leaks of the organization. So the people who run the mainstream organization, and WPATH has tried to frame itself as like a nonpartisan, we're just trying to get to the science on transgender medicine. We now know that they lie publicly. They internally know that this is a major problem. They internally know they don't have the science behind them, and they just lie.
Yeah, I mean, it's enough that, this is an issue that permeates academia and medical research as well, and psychological research, a lot of research, that like there is a big problem that null results just aren't published, and that, only, sort of notable results that also favor people's desired conclusions end up getting published. But this is just a next level worse because they knew.
Well,
they knew.
To understand how much they're lying here, when they said it only concerned the timing of the dates of publication, Yet the Times has reported that at least one of the manuscripts they sought to publish, quote, never saw the light of day, end quote. So they did quash manuscripts that showed that this was hurting people. So
yeah, it's one thing to not publish null results, because I get it. Like it just there's the incentives aren't well aligned, but this is really next level. Yeah, actively irresponsible.
But this is really big, because if you come to me and you say to me, quote, well, look at all this research that showed that this, that this doesn't hurt people. And I'm like, yeah, except I can list like these 3 studies that weren't allowed to be published here, here, and here, right? Like, so your evidence doesn't matter a load of squat, because you were killing other studies, and more important, not killing them due to methodological reasons. Because we can see here, this wasn't killed for methodological reasons. It was killed because of how it could affect people getting access to these treatments. So we know that that's a lie now. We know that that's a lie. Like, the world everybody who looks at the evidence knows that's a lie now. So they're framing this as like just methodological problems or something. But when you have filtered evidence for a period of decades, and note that this filter is now dropping. That's why we're seeing all of these studies that come out now, like the 9 and 10 number and everything like that, because this filter has dropped. But for a period of decades, you could lose your career for publishing a study in this space, and people did. So if you give me data that came out, I'd say like up to the past 3 years for that decade, I basically can't use it. I can't look at it. It's bad data, right?
Yeah.
Like, it has clearly been filtered, and we see the results now of this filter. And so if you're actually interested in what the science says, if you're actually a person, you've got to look at the more recent studies, which all show this is it's doing the opposite of what people say it's doing. It is not a good intervention. And is that any surprise? When we look at other forms of body dysmorphia, like anorexia, you do not intervene by being like, well, I bet I could get your weight down by removing your uterus, and then say, well, the anorexic person said they liked it. Like, of course the anorexic person would like that. They want to get their weight down no matter what, right? But that's not something that you should be indulging, right? But to continue. The Alabama disclosures are not the only example of this reluctance to acknowledge contrary evidence. Last year, Oslin Kennedy said that she had not published her own broad study on mental health outcomes for youth with gender dysphoria because she was worried about its results being quote unquote weaponized. That raised suspicions that she had found only sketchy evidence to support the treatments that she had been prescribing and publicly advocating for over many years. So this woman, this is the woman who said like the double mastectomy for kids, oh, well, you can just get this changed later. Even she, even as biased a scientist as her, in terms of how she was constructing her studies, got evidence that said that this was hurting people and decided not to publish it. Even she, that degree of bias, was unable to find a way to manipulate the data to make it look like these procedures are helping people.
Not ideal.
Last month, her study finally forced appeared as a preprint, a form of scientific publication where evidence of not yet to be the peer-reviewed formalization is finalized. It's titled "Mental and Emotional Health of Youth After 24 Months of Gender-Affirming Medical Care Initiated with Puberty Suppressant." Its participants, quote, demonstrated no significant changes in reported anxiousness or depression, withdrawal or depressed, somatic complaints, social problems, thought problems, attention problems, aggressive behavior, internalizing problems, or externalizing problems.
What are thought problems? I feel like I have a lot of thought problems.
In the 2 years after starting puberty blockers, I have requested comment from Oslo Kennedy via a children's hospital in Los Angeles, the one who was saying, oh, it's either you do this or your kid dies. She hasn't heard back from them because they're unwilling to engage with the new evidence, which just says this does not help. If anything, it increases the rate of unaliving.
Well, this is just one of those things where I think it's just so difficult for a clinic or a researcher to admit to being wrong here after having advised so many families.
Yeah, I mean, when those families come back, they're like, wait a second.
Well, just think about like the malpractice lawsuits, the liability you're subject to. I mean, I can understand the reticence.
Well, and the cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Of the horror.
I mean, because you really believed that. So I understand where they're coming from. I do kind of wish the Atlantic piece were a little bit more like And this has been covered up for a long time, because that's an
They are
interesting.
pointing that out. They are pointing that out. I think that they're reaching out to these people and they're saying, "Oh, well, I don't know about that study. I'm not going to."
Okay. So
We
you
had
think
an
they're doing a
episode-
fair enough job? It seems to me more just like, turns out maybe.
We had an episode where we admit that now when you look at the research, the majority of the research and the majority of educated people know that gender transition is, largely speaking, especially in youth, a bad idea, likely in adults a bad idea, or a way to treat this, the Dutch treatment, as it's called.
Dutch.
And we have an episode where we look at how long it took lobotomies to be phased out of society after basically educated people knew it was a bad idea. And it's about 50 years. And that's really sad. But you can look at our episode on that. But when we published that episode, a Blue Sky user, one of the posts that went viral on Blue Sky about us was like, worst take of the year. That pronatalist couple had this to say about trans individuals, comparing it to lobotomies. And I'm like, well, it's actually super comparable.
I forgot about that. Right.
Lobotomies is that a lot of the people, like the last person who got it, where their surgery went really bad, were requesting it themselves. If you look at later lobotomies, people think that this was something that was forced on people, and in cases it was, but a lot of the later cases was actually sought out by individuals.
Absolutely.
And it bears a lot of structural similarities to what we're seeing with the transgender movement. But anyway, being overly adopted by progressives like the Kennedy family, doing it to their daughter and stuff, and blah, 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 blah. It's about staying in with polite society and not looking weird. And that's, if you say that this is a bad thing, you look like a weirdo, you're killing trans kids, even though we know that's not true. And you are killing trans kids, literally and by the facts. But anyway, or the kids you have labeled as trans. The Travis Stock puberty blocker study, 2011 to 2014, published in 2020. So this isn't from the article, but this is something that I think is important to note.
Okay.
Kelly et al. Published a preprint on Medrivixie in December 2020 after a high court ruling in the Bell and Travis Stock case. So Travis Stock had tried to cover up these findings, and they were forced to publish them during the investigation of their clinics. This was the gender transition clinic.
Okay.
This study involved 44 children aged 12 to 15 who received puberty blockers, GnRHa, to delay puberty. It aimed to assess psychological outcomes, including mental health and gender dysphoria. The study was conducted by Travis Stock's GIDS, University College London Hospitals. The preliminary findings, so these were reported from 2011 to 2014. They weren't forced to publish them until 2020. They treated it
forced to by whom?
In that kid, by the UK court system.
Oh, okay.
They tried to cover this up.
Yeah, because it sounds like they were never going to publish them. That's a sort of weird delay. Okay.
Yeah, they tried to cover this up, but the study in 2015 by the Travis Stock Board of Directors, cited by Transgender Trend, indicated a statistically significant increase in self-harm after 1 year of puberty blockers based on responses to the statement, quote, "I deliberately tried to hurt or kill myself," end quote. So that is what we call unaliving ideation behavior, right? You can say self-harm. That's what they tried to reframe it as. That is not self-harm. Look at the question.
It's highly effective self-harm.
And keep in mind that this and the effect was stronger in girls, by the way. It had more of a negative effect in young girls, which are doing it more now than they did historically. And I'd point out here that this was done by the Travis Stock Clinic, which had every reason to attempt to bias the results in their favor, in the way that they asked the questions, in the way that the data was recorded. The fact that despite that, they showed an increased risk should tell you something.
Wow.
Especially when we now know that when this was disallowed across the UK, it did not lead to a spike in these rates.
Yeah.
Really, really chilling stuff. The reliance on elite consensus over evidence helps make sense of WPATH's flatly hostile response to the Cass report in England, which commissions systemic reviews and recommended extreme caution over the use of puberty blockers and hormones. The review was a direct challenge to WPATH's ability to position itself as the final arbiter of these treatments, something that had become more obvious when the conservative justices referenced the British document in their questions and opinions on Scrutiny. One of WPATH's main charges about Hilary Cass, the senior pediatrician who led the review, was that she was not a gender specialist. In other words, that she was not part of the charmed circle who already agreed with these treatments being beneficial. So they defined gender specialists as people who already agreed and had published that these treatments were beneficial. Which is, I just want to note here, people are like, why do you care so much? Why do you talk so much about this? If you
It's almost like saying like, well, you're not an electroshock therapist because you don't believe that electroshock therapy is the correct therapy for various.
Yeah, where is your long list of electrocuted patients?
Yeah,
And
like, come on, you don't know anything about this.
we even know the person who brought this method to the United States has been like, yeah, this was a mistake. So the experts are against you guys at this point. You just define them as not experts at this point.
Yeah.
Which is really horrifying, horrifying. But the reason when people are like, why do you guys talk about this, given how controversial it is, given how, one, in 5 to 10 years' time, I hope that our society has a good memory about the people who didn't talk about this when they had the chance.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the harm that is being done to children, and we're going to see the harm. We're already beginning to see a flood of detransitioners in online spaces, but they're not going to be confined to online spaces. The same way that you know trans people, you're going to know detransitioners. The same way that you have that trans friend, you're going to have that detransitioner friend, and you're going to feel for them. I will say that to me, the moment where I really began to feel strongly against this was I began to make friends with detransitioners, and I begin to know these people and see them not just as statistics of like, oh, they were killed in this conflict or whatever. These are real people who were manipulated and lied to by doctors and psychologists and told things that were not true. They were told things that weren't true about the surgeries that they undertook. Usually they told things that were not true about the medicine they took, and they were told things that were not true about what happened if they didn't engage with us. And you guys are not going to look like the good guys in history. You guys are going down, and history will have a long memory about what you did and the scale at which you committed these atrocities. But to continue, any thoughts there, Simone, before I continue here?
Just woof.
Because of WPATH's hostility, many on the American left now believe that the Cass review has been discredited. Quote, upon first reading, especially to a person with limited knowledge of the history of transgender healthcare, much of the report might seem reasonable, end quote. Lydian Polgrim wrote at the Times in late August. However, after, quote, poring over the document, end quote, and quote, interviewing experts at gender-affirming care, end quote, which means people who already agree and have performed the procedure at length, Polgar realized that the Cass review was, quote, fundamentally a subjective political document, which anyone who has engaged with it or knows the circumstances of its creation, created by progressives within the United Kingdom, which is already more progressive than our country. If it was a political document, it was a progressive political document. It was a feminist political document, and it did not agree with what they wanted it to. Advocates for youth gender medicine have reacted furiously to articles in the Times and elsewhere that take Cass's conclusion seriously. Indeed, some people inside the information bubble appear to believe that if a respected publication would stop writing about this story, all the doubts and questions, and Republicans' attempt to capitalize on them electorally, would simply disappear. Whenever the Times has published a less than cheerleading article about youth transition, supporters of gender medicine have accused the newspaper of manufacturing a debate that otherwise would not exist. After the Scometti decision, Strategio was still describing media coverage of the issue as quote-unquote insidious, adding, quote, the New York Times especially has been fixating on casting the medical care as being of insufficient quality, end quote. And that's really messed up, that he's like, the New York Times is too conservative on this stuff. With the information they're airing, well, just nobody should be talking about it. I'm like, bro, if it's making it through the New York Times editorial,
implying that there's some kind of insidious, that what a word to use
about something, and I've read some of the attacks on the New York Times. They say 7 anti-transgender articles. So the New York Times apparently is totally okay with publishing this stuff now. The Atlantic is okay with publishing this stuff now. You have lost the centers of elite society, at least in terms of the media. How long till you lose it within academia as well? I mean, now that we're seeing these publications get through. And then what happens then to the people who basically carved swastikas onto their foreheads? It's not going to look good. And I think a lot of people don't understand the consequence. And I repeatedly see this. People are like, oh, I've just been on a little bit of like hormonal medicine. Surely this hasn't affected my fertility. And I'm like, what? Who told you that?
We hear that way too much.
Yeah. I'm like, no, that would have a severe effect on your fertility, my friend. You should look into that. if you underwent that through any window of your life. Now, some people are able to get through this and reclaim their fertility, and even some of our fans have been able to do that. But it is chilling to me, the number of people who just assume that there's not big long-term effects of engaging with this stuff. Can this misinformation bubble ever be burst? On the left, support for youth transition has been rolled together with other issues, such as police reform and climate activism, as a kind of super savo combo deal of correction options. I love that. The 33-year-old Democratic Socialist communist, Zorhan Mohandi, this is the New York communist who got elected recently, made
Mamdani.
funding gender transition, including of minors, part of his pitch to New York as its mayor. And then it's
I didn't know that.
an
Wow.
article here where it says,
Even now?
Yeah,
Gosh, I figured we were past this at this point.
breakout New York mayoral candidate contender Zohar Mohammadi wants to spend
Mamdani.
whatever
Zorhan Mamdani.
$65 million on medical gender treatments for minors and adults. But complicated issues deserve to be treated individually. You can criticize Israel, object to the militarization of America's police forces, and believe that climate change is real, and yet still not support irreversible, experimental, and unproven treatments for children. So I love this where the leftists are like, bro, can we not on this issue? We are definitely the bad guys on this issue. The polarization of this issue in America has been deeply unhelpful for getting liberals to accept the sketchiness of the evidence base. When Vice President J.D. Vance wanted to troll the left, he joined Blue Sky, where skeptics of youth gender transition are among the most blocked users, and immediately started talking about the Scammetti judgment.
What?
Actions like that turn accepting the evidence base into a humiliating climb down, which is true. It should be humiliating. You were messing with kids without any evidence that you believed people who lied to you.
Totally.
And you let sex pests into the movement, and you let the sex pests abuse people like lesbian communities. And they were telling you, the lesbians, for a long time, hey, there are sex pests abusing our community. Can you please do something about this? And you guys just ignored them, right? A lot of the people who've been pushing this have been lesbian organizations. Acknowledging the evidence does not mean that you have to support banning these treatments or reject the idea that some people will be happier if they transition. Cass believes that some youngsters may indeed benefit from the medical pathway. Quote, while some young people may feel an urgency to transition, young adults looking back on their younger selves would often advise slowing down, end quote. Her report concludes, quote, for some, the best outcome will be transition, whereas others may resolve their distress in other ways, end quote. This is not a conservative extremist who wrote this report. They're just like somebody who is predispositioned to statements like that, just found in the evidence no support for this. I have always argued against straightforward bans on medical transition for adolescents. In practice, the way that these have been enacted in red states has been uncaring and punitive. This is the person writing this who is saying this, right? Again, not a conservative. Parents are threatened with child abuse investigations for pursuing treatments that medical professionals have assured them are safe. Yeah, but they should look into whether those medical professionals are lying. But children with severe mental health troubles suddenly lose therapeutic support. Clinics nationwide, including Ossalin Kennedy's, are now abruptly closing because of the political atmosphere. Writing about these subjects in 2023, I argued that the only way out of the culture war was for the American medical associations to commission reviews and carefully consider the evidence. Have an American cast review, of course. However, the revelations from Scammetti and the Alabama case have made me more sympathetic to the commenters such as Leah Sapiro of the Conservative Manhattan Institute, who supports the bans because American medicine cannot be trusted to police itself. Quote, are these bans the perfect solution? Probably not, end quote, he told me in 2023. Quote, but at the end of the day, if it's between banning gender-affirming care and leaving it unregulated, I think we can minimize the amount of harm by banning it, end quote. Once you know that WPATH wanted to publish a review only if it came out of the group's preferred conclusion, Sapiro's case becomes more compelling. And this is something we've seen. The medical community could have self-regulated. It can still go out there and attempt to self-regulate, but anybody who makes this push risks their career at this point, or at least for a period did. Despite the concerted efforts to suppress the evidence, however, the picture on youth gender medicine has become clearer over the past decade. It's no humiliation to update our beliefs as a result. I regularly used to write that medical gender transition was quote unquote life-saving before I saw how limited the evidence on unaliving was. And it took another court case brought by the British detransitioner Kira Bell for me to realize that puberty blockers were not what they were sold as, a quote safe and reversible, in quote, treatment that gave patients, quote unquote, time to think, but instead a one-way ticket to full transition with physical changes that cannot be undone. And I note here almost nobody, when the studies have been done, once you go on blockers, even though we know that 9 out of 10 of these people, if they wouldn't transition, once you go on them, I think it's something like a 98 or 99% transition rate. Like, it's hard to find anybody who doesn't transition afterwards. So we know it is biasing people towards transition, and it's basically forcing them to transition. Some advocates for the Dutch protocol, as it's applied in the United States, have staked their entire career and reputation on its safe and effectiveness. Yeah, if you go out there and you say with the evidence you have now that this is safe and effective, it can be proven that you've lied. They have strong incentives to not concede the weakness of the evidence. In 2023, the advocacy group GLAD drove a truck, and this is in 2023, after a lot of this evidence had come out, after the study that showed 9 out of 10 people, detransition, right? Around the office of the New York Times to declare that, quote unquote, the science is settled, they said on the blog. Doctors such as Oslin Kennedy and activists at Strategio are unlikely to revise their opinions. What can you do when you, as a group like GLAD, that was supposed to be looking out for lesbians, was supposed to be looking out for non-conforming use, when you know that you've now led them on a path that makes unaliving themselves more likely?
Wow.
But that's where we are as a society. No, I mean, the horror of what's been undertaken, people should be held to account for this. And I think that when we as a society, like as things continue to shift, after the wave continues to shift, I think the only way we can make this right is court trials for people who clearly knew the evidence and went out there and pushed young children into this. When you look at something like Tavistock Clinic and we see them covering up evidence, and we know that people in positions of authority within the clinic were actually arrested for going to local parks and attempting to chat up 15-year-old boys, that they liked getting these kids on these blockers so that they would look underage for the rest of their, or for at least a longer period up until when they were legal. And we've seen this talked about within these community forums. This needs to be addressed. And the people who covered for these individuals, there needs to be some degree of punishment, given that they have shown, that people like Strategio have shown that they knew the evidence, that they knew that this was leading to worse outcomes for the people who were engaging with it, and that they attempted to cover this up and increase the prevalence of these treatments.
I mean, we couldn't even ask them to explain why they did this, because I don't even know if they could answer that. Like when you ask people why they do what they do, they really honestly don't know most of the time.
They to me remind me of like the religious extremists that like starve children because they think they're possessed or something, right? Like they just be like, well, yeah, I saw the child was starving. I saw the child was increasing the rate that they hated themselves. We saw this from the Tavistock leaked research, but I decided to not do anything about it, right? And I'll note here that they'll be like, well, that study didn't have a control, or that study didn't have a, yeah, because you chose not to create one after you saw the data. It could have had a control. You chose to not collect that data. That's not, that's like you hid the control. You ensured that there wasn't one because you didn't like what you knew it would say. Anyway, thoughts? We're going to close out.
I'm really glad this age is coming to an end, because, that's fewer lives that will be severely disrupted by this. I also wonder what the next thing is going to be.
And I think what we need to change the narrative. When people are like, you are killing trans kids, it's going to be like, you are killing gender nonconforming kids, which is factually true when you look at the unaliving rates within the trans community. And we know that 9 out of 10 of these people desist from this behavior.
Also, I think the very concept of gender nonconforming runs contrary to progressive ideology. As we've discussed in the John Money podcast, he is the man who in the 1950s and onward pioneered the concept of gender as a construct distinct from biological sex, as like a behavioral and cultural thing.
Right, but
before that, it didn't, you could be gender nonconforming and people wouldn't be like, well, we need to medicalize this.
No, they'd be like, oh, you're a tomboy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're a tomboy, or you're a bit of a girly boy, whatever. But
a bit of a mama's boy.
Yeah, it didn't mean that you needed to undergo some kind of life-altering, permanently biologically shifting treatment. And I think it was a lot more healthy. I'm so excited to go back to that, because we're all for fine, don't conform with, be you.
This reminds me of the meme I sent you that I loved. The next song is called Please don't make me cut off my D because I like the color pink.
There you go.
And I'd note here, Homass actually did a comment on this article where he said, summary, they started saying your children will kill themselves if you don't give them a sex change, and they knew they didn't have the evidence. No one was allowed to argue with it because 100 IQ HR ladies would shut down your entire life if you did. Then the kids who got sex change hormones became more likely to kill themselves because it turns out that what they were going through was just a weird phase. And that's, I like that he's out there pushing this. We've had him on the show before. Check out our episode with him. Have a great day, Simone.
Love you. Toasty, what are you doing?